Derbyshire, 1816. The hearth was little more than a dying glow when Louisa heard the distant rhythm of hooves on the gravel road. She did not rise. She stayed in the worn armchair, fingers laced quietly in her lap, a wool shawl slipping from her shoulders. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Servants dismissed hours ago, shutters closed tight, silence settling over the rooms like snow over stone. He was arriving, the new Marquess, the man who now owned everything, the estate, the title, the right to decide who stayed and who was sent away. Louisa watched the last embers fade and thought of the child who had never cried, thought of the empty cradle stored in the attic, thought of how grief does not always scream. Sometimes it simply takes root in the bones, quiet and cold, like ash after a fire. She knew Benedict Aldridge did not know her. She knew he was the new Marquess, a man rumored to carry ghosts on his shoulders, and she knew he owed her nothing. The hooves fell silent. A distant door slammed shut. Louisa closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for mercy, but for dignity. If he cast her out, she would leave with her head held high. If he ignored her, she would vanish like a shadow. But something inside her, stubborn and small as a coal beneath snow, still glowed, still waited. The drawing-room door opened slowly. Louisa did not look up. She only heard the uneven drag of a cane across the floorboards. Then a voice, low, rough, scraped like metal against stone, cut through the silence. "Who are you?" Louisa Aldridge was no intruder, though she understood why his eyes might see her that way. She was the widow of his cousin, a gentle man who had died before he could inherit, before the war, before learning that life rarely spares the kind-hearted or the frail. After her husband's death, she had remained on the estate out of duty, tending the ailing old Marquess, running the household with steady hands, planting flowers in the garden as one plants hope into barren earth. And when the elderly Marquess finally passed, she had stayed, not by right, but because nowhere else in the world claimed her. No family, no dowry, only that large, quiet, drafty house, which now belonged to a stranger. Benedict Aldridge carried more than a ruined leg. He carried the weight of men he had lost and of commands that still echoed in the dark. He did not come seeking comfort. He came seeking solitude, a place where a man might disappear without witnesses, no questions, no expectations. But she was there, sitting before a fading fire, a silent presence the fates had deliberately left behind. Louisa knew he could send her away with a single word. Her very existence in that drawing room was an inconvenience, a reminder of old family ties he might prefer to forget. And yet, when he looked at her with those dark, exhausted eyes, she lifted her chin and spoke only what was necessary. "My name is Louisa. I am the widow of your cousin Henry." He did not answer at once. He stood leaning on his cane, motionless, as though that name, that quiet thread of a voice, had slipped through a crack in the shield of shadows he'd brought back from the war. And for the first time in a very long while, Louisa felt it was not she who insisted on staying in that house, but something larger, inevitable, something that had chosen that exact moment to begin revealing itself. Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Marquess. She had not expected him to be so tall, nor had she expected the silence he carried like a second skin, dense, heavy, almost tangible. Benedict Aldridge stood in the doorway of the parlor, leaning on an ebony cane, his dark coat marked by the dust of the road. He did not move. He simply looked at her with eyes that seemed to have forgotten their own capacity for surprise. Seated in the worn armchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, the shawl slipping slowly from her shoulders, Louisa met his stare. "My name is Louisa," she said, with a steadiness she had not felt in months. "I was married to your cousin, Henry. I cared for your uncle in his final months, and I still live here." Benedict blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep, numbing haze. He stepped inside, the tap of his cane echoing across the oak floor. The faint light of the dying fire illuminated half his face, the rigid jawline, the thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the hard line of lips belonging to a man who had learned not to expect anything from life. "You still live here," he repeated. Not a question, but a truth that tasted heavy on his tongue. Louisa lifted her chin with quiet dignity. To his eyes, she was nothing more than a woman of 30, dressed in faded mourning, sitting in a house that no longer belonged to her. A widow without dowry, without family, without any rightful claim. But she was also a woman who had survived what many would not, and that silent strength, written in the fine lines of her face, was something Benedict did not yet see. "Yes," she answered, with the calm of someone with nothing left to lose. "I live here, until your lordship decides otherwise." Benedict tilted his head slightly, studying the room, not with hostility, but with the instinct of a man who needed to catalogue every shadow before he could breathe. The nearly extinguished hearth, the worn armchair, a single trembling candle on the table, the heavy curtains keeping daylight at bay. Everything felt less like a home and more like a place where someone waited, without knowing what for. "I didn't know anyone was here," he said at last, his voice rough despite the effort. "No one told you?" "No." Louisa simply nodded. He had returned with no preparation, no announcement, no one willing to send even a single note. He had inherited a title he never sought, an estate he didn't know, and upon crossing the threshold, he did not find the silence he came for, but her. The way his hand tightened around the cane was not a reaction to her presence, but to the entire world that insisted on existing when he wanted only quiet. "I can leave," she offered gently, without drama. "If you prefer solitude, I understand." Benedict looked at her. For an instant something flickered, a faint shadow, a hint of humanity trying to pierce through the armor. He turned his gaze away before it could become visible weakness. His eyes moved from the dying fire to her face, and then he finally asked, "Where would you go?" The question fell between them with the weight of a truth she tried not to reveal. A second passed. 2. The silence answered for her. He turned and walked to the window, the uneven rhythm of his cane marking every step. The sun was bleeding into the hills, staining the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Benedict rested his hand on the windowsill, shoulders stiff, his posture held together by a discipline older than he was. Louisa watched him, the controlled gestures, each movement measured, as if he inhabited a body that no longer obeyed the soul within it. "How long have you stayed here?" he asked without turning. 4 years. He turned just enough for the golden light to outline his profile. "And no one came to claim you?" "There is no one left. My sister has her children. My father's estate passed to my cousin. I belong to no one." The silence that followed felt far too large for such a small room, until Benedict exhaled, a dry, brittle sound, like wind moving through old ruins. "Stay." Louisa's breath caught, her composure breaking for the briefest moment. "Your lordship?" "Stay," he repeated, firm, still gazing at the horizon beyond the window. "But do not ask anything else of me." He left the room without waiting for her reply, the drag of the cane fading into the dark corridor. Louisa remained still, eyes on the extinguished hearth, feeling the weight of that single word settle inside her like a promise she did not dare name. Stay. It had not been kindness. It was the closest thing to mercy Benedict Aldridge was still capable of offering. And for now, it was enough. Chapter 2. The Marquess Stays Awake. Benedict did not sleep that night. He remained in the library, a room that still felt foreign to him, surrounded by books he had never read and furniture he had never chosen, nursing a brandy that could not warm the cold hollow inside him. His cane rested against the leather chair, and his injured leg pulsed with that old, relentless ache, constant, insistent, almost familiar. But it was not the pain that kept him awake. It was the woman downstairs, Louisa. Her name echoed through him like a distant bell, unwelcome, yet impossible to silence. He had not planned to find anyone in the house. He had come to Crichton seeking precisely what the war had stolen from him: silence, absence, a place where he could vanish without witnesses. Instead, he had found a solitary figure seated before a dying fire, dressed in black, hand steady, eyes that asked for nothing, eyes that saw too much. Benedict closed his own, trying to push back what always returned. Falling horses, men screaming, the stench of gunpowder and blood, the faces of those he had not saved. The shadows that followed him from the trenches had never left. They simply waited in the cracks of quiet moments. His fingers tightened around the glass until his knuckles whitened. Captain Aldridge. That was the name he had carried for years. Not Marquess, not Lord. Captain. The man who gave orders. The man responsible for lives. The man who failed. When the news of his inheritance reached him, he had been in a military hospital in Dover, learning to walk again with a leg that would never be trustworthy. His uncle was dead. His cousin had died before him. And suddenly, Benedict Aldridge was the Marquess of Creighton, a title that felt like a shackle. He rose slowly, ignoring the sharp sting in his leg, and walked to the window. Outside, the estate stretched beneath the moonlight in uneven patches of shadow, fields he had never cultivated, walls he had never built, land that had belonged to better men, dead men. He was merely the last surviving name of a lineage that no longer knew what to do with him. The thought returned to the woman, Louisa, with the shawl slipping from her shoulders, the restrained calm in her voice when she offered to leave, the quiet, stubborn dignity, not defiant, but unbreakable. She had not begged, she had not cowered. She had simply spoken the words he could not forget. If your lordship prefers solitude, I understand. And yet she had remained seated, upright, whole. Something in her, something he could not name, had cracked the armor he had spent years forging. She was not his concern, not his responsibility. Yet he had said stay, and now he did not know how to undo the weight of that word. A knock sounded at the door. Benedict turned sharply, hand moving to his cane in a reflex that never left him. The door opened slowly, revealing the housekeeper with a tray. Mrs. Dawson, that was the name she had given earlier, alongside the butler and the cook. 3 faces he had barely registered through the fog of exhaustion. She was a middle-aged woman with a stern face shaped by decades of discipline, yet eyes too gentle to hide everything. Your lordship needs to eat something, she said. It was not a suggestion. Leave it on the table. She did, but did not leave. She remained near the door, hands clasped before her apron. Benedict raised an eyebrow, too tired to hide his irritation. Is there anything else? Mrs. Dawson drew a slow breath, as if weighing her words before releasing them. Lady Louisa, she began. Benedict's whole body tightened. She is a good woman, sir. Her tone was firm, not impertinent. She kept this house standing when the late Marquess fell ill, paid the servants from her own pocket when the accounts were in arrears, never asked for anything, never complained. He remained silent, his fingers gripping the wood of the cane. And she lost a child, the housekeeper added softly. He was born too early, lived less than a day. After that, she was never quite the same. But she never let the grief defeat her. She continued caring for all of us. She continued keeping this place upright. She continued living. A pause, brief and reverent. She deserves respect, my lord, not pity. Respect. Mrs. Dawson bowed her head and left before Benedict could reply. The library sank back into silence. But it was no longer the same silence. The air felt heavier, different, as if a truth had settled in the shadows. She lost a child. The words echoed through him. Slow, deep, devastating. Benedict looked at the empty glass, at the cane, at the moonlight turning everything cold and silver. Louisa carried a war of her own. And for the first time in a very long time, Benedict realized he was not the only survivor in that house. Chapter 3. Before Dawn. Louisa woke before dawn, as she always did. Her room was small, tucked away from the main wing, once the housekeeper's quarters, never meant for family. She had offered no protest when she moved there after her husband's death. It had seemed appropriate, discreet, a place where she could exist without taking up too much space. She dressed in the dark, fingers steady on the buttons of her black gown, her hair pulled into a simple knot. There was no mirror. She had removed them all after the baby died, unable to face the reflection of a woman who continued breathing when he had not. She descended the stairs silently, soft slippers gliding over cold wood. The house was still asleep. The servants would not arrive until 6, and Benedict, she knew, had likely remained in the library through the night. She had seen the sliver of light beneath the door, had heard the uneven drag of his cane, the heavy quiet he carried like a second shadow. He had not slept. Neither had she. The kitchen was cold. Louisa lit the stove, filled the kettle, and prepared tea, an old habit from the months she spent caring for her ailing father-in-law, rising before everyone, keeping her hands busy, preventing her mind from wandering into painful places. The habit had remained even when there was no one left to tend but herself, and the silence that sometimes felt bigger than the house itself. As the water heated, she looked out the window toward the garden she had planted with her own hands. Autumn was deepening, wilted roses, golden leaves falling like contained tears. Louisa thought of the child who would never see flowers bloom. She thought of Benedict, with his ruined leg and hollow eyes, and she thought of how pain sometimes bound together people who should never have crossed paths. Footsteps. She turned, heart thudding. Benedict stood in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning on his cane, eyes bloodshot, face marked by a night without rest. He wore the same clothes from yesterday, loosened cravat, wrinkled shirt, dark hair rumpled. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to live. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough. "I did not expect anyone to be awake. Anyone. Not you." Distance dripped from the single word, formality used as armor. Louisa understood instantly. When Benedict did not know how to engage, he retreated behind etiquette like a soldier diving back into the trenches. "The tea is nearly ready," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Would your lordship care for a cup?" He hesitated. She saw the conflict clearly. Accepting would be vulnerability. Refusing would be cruelty. He chose the narrow space between the two. "Thank you." Louisa served 2 cups and placed one before him on the small wooden table. Benedict sat with difficulty, extending his injured leg to the side. His cane rested against the chair. They drank in silence. Not uncomfortable. Just empty. 2 survivors on opposite banks of the same river. Then Benedict spoke, suddenly, unguardedly, as if something slipped past his defenses. "The housekeeper told me about your child." Louisa's heart stopped for a full second. Her hands remained steady on the cup, but the air vanished from the room. She did not answer. There was no answer. Benedict continued, voice lower now, almost careful. "I am sorry for your loss." She looked up. He did not look away. There was something raw in his honesty, something unarmored, that touched her more deeply than any gentle phrase could have. "And I am sorry for yours," Louisa said softly. "For the men you lost, for the leg that did not return whole, for the life you left on the battlefield." Benedict stiffened. For a moment she thought he would rise and flee the room. But he only closed his eyes, and when he spoke, the words were hard, broken. "I should not have survived. But you did. Better men died. And does that make you less deserving of breath?" He opened his eyes slowly, staring at her with something between anger and despair. The kind of despair only those who return from war can carry. "I was the commander," he murmured. "I gave the orders. They died because I failed." Louisa held his gaze. "Or they died because war spares no one. Not the good, not the brave, not the ones who do the best they can with the little they have." The silence fell thick between them, like heavy winter snow. Benedict looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a burden, not as an echo of family obligation, but as someone who understood, someone who also carried her dead with her. He looked away first, drawing a strained breath. "Why are you still here?" he asked. There was no anger, only bewilderment. "Why didn't you leave when you had the chance?" Louisa smiled. A sad, small, honest smile. Because leaving would mean admitting there is no place in the world for me, and I am not ready to accept that. Benedict studied her for a long moment, and then finally he nodded, slowly, almost reluctantly, as though recognizing a painful truth. "Then stay," he said, his voice gentler than any tone she had ever heard from him. "For as long as you need." It was not mercy. It was not charity. It was respect. And for the first time in 4 years, Louisa felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she was no longer entirely alone. Chapter 4. Winter at Creighton. 2 months had passed since Benedict arrived at Creighton. Autumn had surrendered to winter. Heavy snow over the fields, roads rendered impassable, days far too short and nights far too long. The isolation of the estate had deepened, and Benedict had learned unwillingly the quiet rhythms of Louisa, the soft tread of her steps at dawn, the faint lavender scent she left lingering in the corridors, the way she smiled at the servants even when her eyes threatened to betray old sorrow. He had not meant to care, but Louisa was impossible to ignore. She kept the house alive, with small arrangements of dried winter branches on the tables, candles lit in the coldest corners, gentle words that occasionally coaxed a rare smile out of Mrs. Dawson. Louisa never took up space. She created warmth where once there had been only absence. Benedict had spent the day avoiding her, as he always did when thoughts of her grew too persistent. He spent the morning in the stables, inspecting horses and hay with the stable-master, a man of few words who never commented on the cane nor on the silence. He spent the afternoon reviewing account books in the library, numbers that blurred before his eyes, refusing to settle in a mind more accustomed to trenches than to the weight of an inherited estate. But wherever he went, corridor, hall, drawing room, Louisa's presence lingered, subtle and persistent, like a forgotten perfume on the palm of one's hand. Then stay, for as long as you need. He shut the ledger with unnecessary force. Why had he said that? He had come to Creighton seeking isolation, not obligations. He did not want to care for anyone. He did not want to be seen. But Louisa saw him, with those calm, steady eyes that missed nothing, and that frightened him more than any battlefield scream. Benedict rose and walked to the window. Outside, thick snowflakes fell over the garden Louisa had planted. She was there, even in the cutting cold, kneeling in the frozen earth, tugging at stubborn winter weeds. No servant at her side, no assistance. Just her, tending a garden that looked dead, yet she refused to let it die. He watched her for a long time. The delicate line of her bent shoulders, the determined movements of her gloved hands. There was something fierce in that fragility, a quiet defiance, like a flower growing between stones, stubborn, unbreakable, impossible to uproot. She lost her child. Mrs. Dawson's words struck again, arrow-sharp in the dark. Benedict knew loss, but hers was something else entirely. Not soldiers fallen in mud, not impossible decisions made under fire, but the loss of what should never have been taken, the loss of a miracle, of a promise. And still, she knelt in the snow, tending a garden in winter. Benedict turned away from the window. He had no right to admire her, no right to feel anything. He was a broken man, held upright by a leg that barely obeyed him. But Louisa, the way she existed, breathed, kept moving, chipped away, bit by bit, at the armor he had built around his chest. A knock on the door. Benedict straightened, expecting Mrs. Dawson. But it was the butler, Graves. Posture impeccable, expression solemn. "Your lordship, correspondence has arrived." He handed a sealed letter. From the law office in London. Benedict recognized the seal. He opened it with practiced precision. His hands never trembled. He had trained himself out of that on the battlefield. He read signatures, inheritance details, administrative matters. And then, at the very end, a single line that froze his blood. Regarding the widow of the late Henry Aldridge, the law states, "Your lordship holds no legal obligation to keep her on the estate. Should you wish to proceed with removal, We can prepare the necessary documents. Removal. As if Louisa were an item. As if 4 years of devotion and grief meant nothing. As if the woman who had given so much and received so little were nothing more than an inconvenience. Benedict read the sentence 3 times. Then he crushed the letter in his hand and threw it into the fireplace. He watched the edges curl and blacken, watched the paper shrink and disappear into ash. "Graves," he said at last, voice low but iron strong. "Send a reply. Lady Louisa will remain on this estate for as long as she wishes. There will be no further discussion." The butler blinked, surprised, if only for a fraction of a second, enough for Benedict to notice. Then he bowed. "Yes, your lordship." When Graves left, Benedict stood before the fire. He watched the flames consume what remained of the letter, watched the light flicker across the walls, the carpet, the hand gripping his cane, and he realized he had lost control of the situation long ago. He had come seeking solitude. He had found a woman who understood silence. He had come seeking disappearance. He had found someone who was disappearing too, slowly, quietly, like a candle burning itself out without a flame. And for the first time since the war, Benedict felt something other than guilt. He felt responsibility. Not the military burden of a commander, not the impersonal weight of an inherited title, but the simple human responsibility of not letting someone fall when he still had the strength to hold them up. Louisa had never asked for help. She never asked for anything, but her dignity, quiet, resilient, unyielding, stirred something in him he could not yet name. He returned to the window. Louisa was on her feet now, brushing snow from her gloves. She lifted her face toward the gray sky. Snowflakes settled in her dark hair like lost stars. For a moment, she looked less like a widow and more like a woman remembering how to breathe. Something tightened in his chest. A warm ache. A warning. He stepped back from the window before she could see him watching. But the image lingered, a silent reminder of what could bloom even beneath the ice. And Benedict knew, with quiet, unavoidable clarity, he would not send her away, even if he tried. Chapter 5. Conversations. Louisa had not expected him to seek her out, but the following afternoon, while she sat in the small library, not the great one where Benedict spent his evenings, but the warm little room that once belonged to her mother-in-law, the door opened and he stepped inside. Louisa lifted her gaze from the volume of poetry she had not truly been reading. Benedict paused at the threshold, leaning on his cane, wearing an expression that was equal parts hesitation and resolve. His clothes were clean, his hair combed, his beard trimmed. He still looked weary, still carried shadows behind the eyes, but there was something different about him, as if, for the first time in a very long while, he had chosen to face whatever frightened him. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, far too formal to hide the tension beneath. "I wish to speak with you if it is convenient." Louisa closed the book slowly, fingers trembling just a little. "Of course, your lordship." She gestured to the chair by the fire. "Please." Benedict lowered himself into the seat with his usual difficulty, stretching the injured leg, cane resting at his side. Louisa waited. Silence did not intimidate her. She had learned to inhabit it the same way one inhabits an empty house. But Benedict seemed to struggle with each word, as if every syllable had to cross a field of unseen mines. "I received correspondence from the solicitors," he said at last. Louisa's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming. She was ready to hear it. Removal, departure, farewell. She had already imagined how she would leave with dignity. But Benedict continued. "They advised me to settle. The matter of your presence in this house." He drew a steadying breath. "I sent my answer this morning. You will remain at Creighton for as long as you wish." Louisa went utterly still. For as long as you wish. As if she had a choice. As if it mattered. Her breath faltered for a heartbeat. Benedict finally raised his eyes. And what she saw there was not condescension. It was rawness, humanity, a near vulnerability. "It was not charity," he said quickly, as though anticipating her thought. "It was justice. You cared for my uncle. You kept this house running. You have done more for Creighton than I have since arriving. He looked away, uncomfortable. You have as much right to be here as I do. Louisa's eyes burned, but she did not cry. She had not cried since the day her son was buried. She simply nodded, hands clasped over the forgotten book in her lap. Thank you, she murmured. The word felt far too small for what she wanted to say. Benedict shifted, glancing toward the shelves as if seeking refuge among the books. You read poetry? He asked suddenly, unexpectedly. Louisa blinked. Yes. She lifted the book. Wordsworth. My husband used to read to me. Was he a kind man? The question was so direct, so honest, that Louisa took a moment before answering. He was, perhaps too gentle for this world. A soft, sad smile touched her lips. He died in a hunting accident 3 years into our marriage. He never had the chance to meet our son, the son we lost. Benedict was silent for a long time, long enough for Louisa to think he regretted asking. But then he spoke, and his voice was low, cracked. Sometimes I think the gentle ones are the only ones who deserve to live, and yet they are always the first to go. Louisa looked at him. She saw the strong hands tightening on the cane as if holding up something that might collapse. The jaw clenched, the eyes carrying the weight of entire graveyards. He was not speaking only of Henry. He spoke of men he had lost, of friends he had commanded into death. You are not cruel for having survived, your lordship, she said, her voice calm and firm. You are simply human. He lifted his gaze as though she had spoken something impossible. War turns men into monsters, he murmured. It was not dramatization, it was confession. I gave orders that killed my friends, chose missions over lives. And now? He gestured vaguely, pain crossing his features. Now I am here, inheriting a title I do not deserve. Alive, when better men never had the chance. Louisa rose slowly, stepped toward him, stopped in front of his chair. Benedict looked up, startled. She did not touch him, did not bow, did not kneel. She simply stood, present, steady, as if her very silence held him upright. War creates monsters, she said softly, but monsters feel no guilt. They do not mourn. They do not wake in the night hearing the names of men they could not save. She drew a breath. You are not a monster. You are a broken man, and broken men can still be mended. Something shifted in him, a tremor beneath the surface, quickly hidden again. He looked away, fingers gripping the cane until his knuckles blanched. I don't know if I believe that, he whispered. I don't know either, Louisa admitted. But I keep trying. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, heavy with everything they did not know how to say. Benedict stood slowly, bracing himself on the cane. He faced her, close enough for Louisa to see the thin scar slicing through his brow, the exhaustion etched in his skin, the shadows that refused to leave him. Thank you, he said. It was not formal, not polite. It was true. Louisa nodded, unable to speak. Benedict left the room without looking back. The door closed softly behind him, and Louisa remained by the fire for a long time, heart racing, hands trembling, not with fear, but with something she had long believed lost. Something had shifted, something important, something that might, just might, be beginning to grow, or return. She was no longer alone, and Benedict, perhaps he was not alone anymore either. Chapter 6. The First Glimpse of Light. Benedict spent the next 3 days trying not to think about her. He failed spectacularly. Louisa was everywhere, not in presence, but in memory. The shawl she had forgotten on the armchair in the library, the soft laughter she shared with Mrs. Dawson over dried winter bouquets, books of poetry left open, ribbon marked by fingers that turned pages like someone returning to life in pequeñas doses. And at night, when sleep refused him, as it always did, he heard her words echoing through the darkness like the quietest of rebellions. Broken men can still be mended. He didn't believe it, but he wanted to believe. And that wanting, small, stubborn, dangerous, terrified him more than any musket fire ever did. He was in the library pretending to read documents that made no sense when Mrs. Dawson knocked. Benedict lifted his gaze. The housekeeper entered carefully, as if aware she might be interrupting something fragile. "Your lordship, Lady Louisa requests permission to dine downstairs this evening," she said softly. "She has been taking her meals alone in her room since your arrival. I thought that perhaps—" Something twisted in his chest. Of course. Louisa had retreated the way she always did. Not to avoid him, but to avoid occupying space she was convinced she did not deserve. Not fear. Habit. Survival. "Tell Lady Louisa," he said, voice rougher than intended, "that her presence at the table is not only permitted, it is expected." He hesitated. "And tell her, I am sorry she believed she needed permission." Mrs. Dawson's smile, rare, brief, nearly maternal, softened the room. "Yes, my lord." When she left, Benedict sat motionless, staring at the empty space as the realization settled heavy on his shoulders. He had sought solitude at Crichton, and forgotten that solitude, when misdirected, becomes cruelty. Louisa was not an intruder. She was a survivor. And he, through his silence, had deepened the cold of a house she alone kept standing. He pushed himself up with his cane and limped to the window. There she was again, kneeling in the frozen garden among winter-shorn roses. She moved through the withered beds with hands bare despite the cold, touching the soil gently, fiercely, as though coaxing it back to life. The scene felt almost sacred, a quiet ritual, a prayer of persistence, the curve of her shoulders, the determination of her hands, the stubborn, fragile hope. Something inside him shifted, something he had buried too deeply to name. No. He stepped back from the window as from a rising danger. He could not feel this. He had no right. He was a broken man, held together by a cane and a will cracked at the seams. And Louisa deserved something, someone, whole, alive, unscarred. But that night, when he entered the dining room, she was already there. She rose when he walked in, the same black dress, but her hair was loose, falling softly around her shoulders. In the candlelight she looked less like a widow and more like the memory of spring, something beginning again, even in winter. "My lord," she murmured. "Lady Louisa," he replied, indicating her chair. "Please." They ate in silence at first, not uncomfortable, just careful, like two survivors learning the contours of an unfamiliar truce. Then, midway through the second course, she spoke. "Your lordship honors me with your company." He blinked, surprised by the gentleness. "I am the one who should apologize," he said quietly. "You should never have dined alone." Her smile was small, soft, tinged with something older than grief. "It was not imposed upon me. It was habit. I learned not to take up too much space." Benedict placed his knife down slowly, a weight of late understanding settling between them. "You are not an inconvenience," he said firmly. "This house is as much yours as mine." She lowered her gaze. "But it isn't," she said without bitterness. "It belongs to you. I merely remain." "You remain because you have earned that right," he countered, steady. "You kept this house alive when no one else could. That is worth more than any deed." She didn't answer, but in her eyes he saw a quiet battle, between daring to believe and fearing belief itself. He knew that battle well. He lived inside it. "Why do you care so much for the roses?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "The roses in the garden," he clarified. "I see you with them every day. Why?" She took so long to answer he thought she might not at all. Then, "When my son died," her voice thinned, softened to a trembling thread, "I thought I would never see beauty again. Not in the world, not anywhere. But roses grow. Even in winter. Even when no one tends them. They keep going. And Her eyes glistened. "I need to believe I can too." A crack opened in his chest. Not pain. Recognition. Louisa wasn't merely surviving. She was wrestling the void, just as he was. "I used to ride," Benedict said quietly. Before the war, before the leg, horses were everything. Freedom, power, flight. Now, he glanced at the cane. Now I barely walk without agony. Louisa watched him with eyes that saw far too deeply. But you still walk, she whispered. Yes. Then there is still hope. He stared at her until the air between them trembled. A delicate, dangerous thread. He wanted to break it. Wanted to crush any hope she placed in him, but he couldn't. Perhaps, he breathed. And somehow, it was the truest thing he had said in years. The rest of the meal passed in warm, quiet currents. When they rose, Benedict, without thinking, offered her his arm. She hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. They walked together to the hall, his cane marking the pace. Her hand, light as warmth after frost. At the foot of the stairs, she released him. "Good night, my lord," she said. "And thank you." "For what?" he asked, truly baffled. "For reminding me that I can still sit at a table." Her smile was small, tender. "That I can still exist outside the shadows in this house." He found no words. She ascended the staircase, and he stood where she left him, long after she had disappeared. Something was growing inside him. Something unwelcome. Something warm. Something impossible. Something perilously close to hope. Chapter 7. The First Shaft of Light. Louisa couldn't stop thinking about the touch. It had been nothing more than a gentleman offering his arm. Courtesy, etiquette, nothing of consequence. And yet Benedict's hand beneath hers, steady and warm, lingered like an invisible mark, an echo pressed against her skin. For the next 2 days, she tried to convince herself it meant nothing. She failed completely, because Benedict had begun to change. Not in grand gestures, not in anything the world would notice, but in small, careful shifts, so delicate that only someone who had learned to survive on crumbs of kindness would recognize them. He greeted her in the morning. He commented on the books she left on the table. He sat at dinner with a posture less rigid, less brittle, less about to shatter. And sometimes, just sometimes, he smiled. Tiny smiles, restrained, as if afraid the world might witness them. To Louisa, they felt like earthquakes. "No," she scolded herself for the 100th time as she knelt among the roses fading before the winter frost. She had no right to feel anything at all. He was a Marquess. She was a nameless widow, living on the grace of a house that wasn't hers. Benedict had offered shelter out of decency, not desire. Hope was a dangerous luxury for women like her. "The roses are dying." Louisa startled, then turned to see him standing on the stone path. Benedict leaned on his cane, studying her as though trying to decipher something in her, or in himself. The wind tousled his dark hair. His overcoat outlined the breadth of his shoulders, and for a fleeting moment he looked less like a haunted shadow, more like a man. "Yes," Louisa said, brushing soil from her hands. "Autumn came early this year." Benedict walked toward her, the soft drag of his cane marking his steps, an intimate, painful reminder of the war carved into him. He stopped beside her, gazing at the wilted roses with something almost ceremonial in his stillness. "My mother planted roses," he said suddenly. "Before I left for the war. She used to say roses were like hope, fragile, yet stubborn." His voice lowered. "She died while I was away. I never got to say goodbye." Louisa rose slowly, skirt stained with earth, and stood next to him. She didn't touch him. She simply remained there, a quiet presence he accepted like breath after holding it too long. "Sometimes I think," he continued, "that everything I touch dies. Men, family, even these damned roses. Roses die in autumn," Louisa murmured gently. "Not because of someone's hand, because it is their nature. They return in spring." He turned to look at her. His gaze was raw, an open wound offered to her without a word. "And if spring never comes?" "It always does," she whispered. "Even when we no longer believe in it." They stood together, side by side, watching the nearly dead garden that stubbornly insisted on living. Then Benedict did something she never expected. He extended his free hand, the one not gripping the cane, and touched her arm, a light touch, barely there. But it meant everything: connection, recognition, two shipwrecked souls finding each other in the same tide. "Thank you," he said. And Louisa knew he wasn't thanking her for the words. He was thanking her for existing there, for not fleeing from his silence, for staying. "There's nothing to thank me for," she whispered. He let go slowly, but something remained, something invisible, impossible to undo. He turned as if to leave, then paused. His entire body seemed to hold its breath. "Have dinner with me tonight." A beat. Not out of courtesy, but because— He closed his eyes for a moment. "Because I prefer your company to the silence." Louisa felt the world stop. It wasn't a request. It was a confession. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, far quicker than reason allowed. Benedict looked back over his shoulder. A flash, brief, real, dangerous, passed through his eyes. He nodded once and walked back toward the house, leaving Louisa trembling among the dying roses. She knew she was falling. She knew it was reckless. She knew men like Benedict, broken, haunted, learning how to live again, made no promises. But when she looked at the roses drying too soon, she thought of spring, thought of life that grows even in frost, and allowed herself, for the first time since losing her child, a thread of hope. Dinner that night was different. Benedict didn't just speak. He opened himself. He told her about the horses he once rode before the war, about the cousin she had loved, and how they ran wild together across the hills as boys, about the mother who planted roses and believed beauty was an act of resistance. And Louisa listened. Her heart ached, not with sorrow, but recognition. When the meal ended, Benedict rose and offered his arm. But this time, when Louisa rested her hand there, he covered it with his own. Briefly, gently, as one touches something too precious for the world. They walked together until the foot of the staircase. Louisa released his arm, but he held her hand for a heartbeat longer. A moment. A sigh. A promise neither dared translate. "Good night, Louisa," he said, using her name for the first time. "Good night, Benedict," she whispered, unable to hide the tremor. He smiled, small, painfully genuine, and let her hand go. Louisa climbed the steps without turning back, but she felt his gaze rising with her, following each step, each breath, until she vanished down the dark corridor. Inside her room, she closed the door and leaned against it. Her heart pounded like a church bell. Her hands trembled. And Louisa knew, with the certainty only the night's silence brings, that something had changed. Something in her, something in him, something between them. And for the first time in 4 years, she felt, with fear, with faith, with trembling, that perhaps life still waited for her beyond grief. Chapter 8. A Decision. Benedict knew he was lost. It hadn't happened suddenly. It wasn't reckless desire or some foolish burst of passion. It was slow, gradual, silent, like a tide rising inch by inch, licking the edges of the stones, until, without warning, there is no dry ground left beneath one's feet. Every shared dinner, every conversation about roses, war, and wounds that refused to heal. Every time Louisa smiled, small, careful, nearly sad, and something inside him remembered what it meant to feel alive. He had tried to resist her. God knew he had. But how does a man resist sunlight after years spent in darkness? He was in the stables when he made the decision. The steward had just left, leaving him alone with the scent of hay and leather, ghosts of a life before the war, when he had still been whole. Benedict approached the stall of the black stallion, the horse he hadn't ridden since the war, and pressed his forehead gently to the animal's warm muzzle. "I'm a fool," he muttered. The horse snorted softly, almost in agreement. He had no right to court her, nothing to offer her except a title he never wanted, a failing leg and a soul full of ghosts. But Louisa saw all of it. She saw the scars, the guilt, the brokenness, and still stayed, still met his gaze, still breathed beside him without flinching from his shadows, And that, God help him, destroyed him and rebuilt him in the same breath. The stable door opened. Benedict turned sharply. Graves, the butler, stood in the doorway, upright, composed, unfailingly proper. "Your lordship, a visitor has arrived. Mr. Hollister, the estate manager from the neighboring county. He requests an audience." Irritation flashed through Benedict. He wanted no visitors, no interruptions. But responsibility rarely waits for a man's state of mind. "Show him to the library. I'll be there shortly." When Graves left, Benedict straightened his coat, collected his cane, and walked toward the house. The cold made his leg ache sharply, but pain was an old companion, one he barely acknowledged anymore. Mr. Hollister awaited him in the library, standing stiffly, eyes sharp enough to measure every detail in the room. He bowed as Benedict entered. "My lord, an honor." "Mr. Hollister," Benedict gestured to a chair before lowering himself stiffly into his own. "What can I do for you?" They discussed boundaries, rents, land disputes, words without weight, formalities without soul. Until Hollister said, far too casually, "I've heard your lordship has allowed Lady Louisa to remain in residence." The sentence fell into the air like a blade. Benedict went perfectly still. "Yes," he said, each syllable cold as steel. "Is there a problem?" Hollister lifted both hands quickly, as if to defend himself. "None at all, of course, only that, well, it is an unusual arrangement. A young widow living under the same roof as a single gentleman. People may talk." Benedict's blood turned to ice. "Let them talk," he said, voice forged of winter. "Lady Louisa cared for my uncle. She kept this estate running when no one else could. She will remain here as long as she wishes. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, improper in that." Hollister blinked, stunned by the force of the reply. "Of course, my lord. I meant no Then do not insinuate." A heavy silence followed. They finished the remaining business quickly, and when Hollister finally departed, Benedict remained alone in the library, rage burning in tight, merciless circles in his chest. People may talk. Let them. He cared little for gossip. But to tarnish her? To reduce Louisa, extraordinary, resilient Louisa, to the subject of idle tongues? That awakened a primitive fury in him, and then the truth struck with brutal clarity. There was only one way to protect her completely: marriage. The word struck him like a stone dropped into still water, sending violent ripples through everything he thought he understood. Marry Louisa. Make her a marchioness. Give her permanent, unquestioned place. Shield her forever from the world's cruelty. But would it be fair? He limped. He woke screaming from nightmares. He carried death in his bones and guilt in every breath. Louisa deserved more than a broken man. He limped toward the window. Outside, Louisa walked the path leading toward the stables. Slow steps, her dark cloak shifting with the winter wind. She absorbed the cold without bending to it. Delicate, resilient, endlessly strong. She wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was simply breathing the world in the quiet way she did when she needed to steady her heart. And as Benedict watched her, something inside him aligned with painful clarity. It did not matter whether he deserved her. What mattered was that he could no longer imagine Creighton without her. No mornings without the soft sound of her steps. No nights without knowing she was somewhere in the house. No dinners without her quiet presence, warm and steady. What had awakened inside him, what he believed the war had murdered, now pulsed alive and dangerous. It wasn't just respect. It wasn't just gratitude. It was desire. It was affection. It was attachment. It was love he dared not name. And it terrified him. Benedict stepped away from the window, heart pounding with a strength he hadn't felt in years. He needed a ring, words, courage. But first, he needed the one thing he could not force: certainty. Did Louisa feel anything for him? Anything beyond gratitude, beyond habit, beyond comfort? If she did, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could ask her to be his wife. He would dine with her tonight. Watch carefully. Search for signs. and if he found them, their fates would change forever. For the first time since leaving the battlefield, Benedict Aldridge allowed himself to want something for himself. And what he wanted, more than any title, more than any legacy, more than peace itself, was the woman in mourning black who made him believe broken men could still be mended. Chapter 9. The Scar. The days that followed felt different. Louisa could not pinpoint when it began, nor which gesture marked the shift. But something had changed, subtly, quietly, irrevocably. Benedict sought her out more often. Not in a hurried way, nor with insistence, but with presence. A presence she sensed even before hearing the steady rhythm of his cane in the corridor. He appeared in the small library and sat with a book he rarely read. He walked beside her in the garden, even when the winter air bit at his lungs. He asked her thoughts on minor estate matters, as if her voice held real weight. And he looked at her. Oh, how he looked at her. As though memorizing the shape of her face, as though afraid it might vanish if he blinked. That afternoon, soft winter light filtered through the windows of the little music room. Louisa pretended to embroider, the needle unmoving in her fingers for several minutes, when she heard it, the unmistakable cadence of Benedict's cane. She lifted her eyes. Benedict. He inclined his head in greeting, offering a small, hesitant smile. Subtle, almost shy, but undeniably real. He stepped through the doorway and approached the chair beside hers. "May I?" he asked quietly. "Of course," Louisa replied, shifting slightly to make space. He eased into the chair with the familiar stiffness of old wounds, drawing in a long breath as though carrying a weight older than language. For a moment, they simply sat, sharing a silence that was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two souls learning to carry pain side by side. Louisa waited. She always knew. With Benedict, words came only when the heart was ready to release them, like leaves falling only when the branch has loosened its grip. And at last, they came. He stared into the fire, though his thoughts were far beyond the room, stuck somewhere that still burned. When he finally spoke, it was not to her face but to his own hands. Strong hands, marked by pale scars. His name was Richard, Benedict said, voice low and steady only on the surface. We were friends since boyhood. We enlisted together. Louisa did not breathe. The day he died, Benedict continued, I was 50 yards away. I saw everything. The cannon shot, the horse falling, the impact. His voice trembled. And I could do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Louisa's eyes stung, but she remained silent, letting him unravel what he had buried for too long. I was their commander, he said, rougher now. It was my duty to keep them alive, to make decisions that meant survival. His jaw tightened. But in that moment, I was just a man watching my best friend die, unable to reach him, unable to save him, unable to bring any part of him home. Louisa rose slowly. Her skirt brushed the carpet as she moved toward him. She knelt before him, a gesture improper in any other setting. But here, it was the only possible one. She took his hands in hers. You could not have saved him. I should have found a way, Benedict rasped, the pain in his voice so raw she had to steady her own breath. I was their leader, trained to find solutions, to protect my men. And instead I stood there, watching, breathing when he no longer could. Benedict? Louisa whispered, tightening her hold as if anchoring him. There was nothing you could have done. You don't understand, he said, voice breaking. I failed him, Louisa, and so many others. Every face I see when I close my eyes, every man who didn't come back. He pulled her hands against his chest, a desperate, wordless plea. Louisa looked up at him through tears she did not bother to hide. You are not alone now. He blinked, confused, almost disbelieving, as if the idea itself were foreign. Louisa let go of one hand and touched his face. Gently, tenderly, firmly. Richard knew the risks, she said softly. He fought beside you because he trusted you. And you honor him, not by dying with him, but by living, by remembering, by feeling this deeply, even now. She swallowed. Men who do not care do not feel this, Benedict. They do not carry the dead. They step over them. Sometimes I want to step over it, he whispered. Just move on. Forget. But you can't, she said, because you are a good man, and good men don't forget. He looked at her as though the world had tilted beneath his feet. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he pulled her into his arms, not with passion, with need, with the quiet desperation of someone finally reaching for something that keeps him from drowning. Louisa wrapped her arms around him, and Benedict pressed his face to her shoulder, breath trembling, as though the air itself hurt to hold. His shoulders shook, not from weakness, from release. They stayed like that for a long time, suspended in a moment that existed outside of clocks or propriety. When he finally pulled back, something had shifted in his eyes. Not peace, but the first fragile spark of it. Benedict raised a hand to her cheek, touching her with reverence, as though she were something sacred. Then he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, a kiss of surrender, of gratitude, of silent promise. Thank you, he whispered against her skin. For what? She breathed. For not making me carry this alone. Louisa smiled through her tears, still kneeling, still holding his hands as if holding something newly restored. Benedict helped her stand, but did not release her. They stood in the center of the music room, hands intertwined, bodies too close to be merely acquaintances. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. You have changed everything, he said, voice low. Since the moment you arrived, since that first night, you changed everything. Louisa had no words. She simply held his hands tighter, letting the silence answer for her. When Benedict finally released her and left the room, Louisa remained perfectly still, as though any movement might break the fragile miracle forming around them. Something was happening, something real, something irreversible. And for the first time since she buried her child, Louisa did not fear the storm gathering around her. She welcomed it, with open arms, with trembling hope. Chapter 10. The Proposal. Benedict knew it was today. He woke with the certainty burning in his chest like a live ember. No doubts, no shadows of hesitation, no fear strong enough to hold him back. Only a fierce, unmistakable clarity. He would ask Louisa to marry him. Today. And if she said yes, he would spend the rest of his life grateful that he had survived the war long enough to find her, even if he was not worthy of the gift. He dressed carefully, more carefully than he had in years. His hands were steady, surprisingly steady, as he reached for the ring in his waistcoat pocket. Plain gold, a small ruby in the center. The ring his mother had worn for 30 years. He held it up to the pale morning light, the red stone glowing like a living heart. God, give me courage. Give me the right words. He tucked the ring away, took the cane, and went downstairs. Louisa turned the moment she heard his steps. She smiled, that small, reserved smile she offered only to him when she thought no one was watching. Benedict, you should be inside. It's far too cold. You could say the same about yourself. He stepped closer. The garden still slept under winter's weight, but the rose bushes, they were hiding a secret. The roses are coming back. They always do. She touched one of the tiny buds with gentle fingers. I told you they would. And you were right, he said, turning fully toward her. In more ways than you realize. Louisa tilted her head, her quiet curiosity softening her entire face. About what? About broken men being able to be mended. He took a deeper breath. About spring returning even when it seems impossible. About not carrying everything alone. Something in her shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but deep. Her eyes widened just a fraction. Her chest rose in a silent, bracing breath. She was waiting for something she perhaps feared to name. Benedict took her hand. Louisa, I need to ask you something. But first, you must know 3 things. His voice was steady, but vulnerable in a way he had never allowed it to be. First, you will always have a place here. Always. This house is as much yours as it is mine. Second, I am not a perfect man. I have nightmares. I limp. I carry far too many ghosts. And third, he paused, only a heartbeat. Third, I do not know if I deserve you, but I know I love you. The quiet, stunned shock on her face, the tears rising before she could stop them. Benedict, please let me finish. He tightened his grip on her hand. I love you. I don't know when it began. Perhaps when I watched you from the window, tending the roses. Perhaps when you held me together while I broke. Perhaps when I realized I could no longer imagine this house without your presence. But I love you, Louisa. In a way, I never thought I would be able to love again. And if you'll accept me? He reached into his pocket and drew out the ring. I will spend my life trying to be worthy of it. Then he sank to one knee, ignoring the sharp, burning protest of his leg, ignoring everything except the woman before him. Louisa Aldridge, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The world went utterly still. No birds, no wind, only her trembling breath. Louisa lifted her hands to her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks. 1 second, 2, 3. Yes! The word came out as a broken whisper, but firm as a vow. Benedict blinked, as if he needed to hear it again. Yes? Yes. Louisa fell to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in both hands. Yes, Benedict. Of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. Real trembling, the first he had felt all morning. And when he finished, he drew her into his arms with a force that felt like gravity itself. I never want you to leave this house again, he murmured into her hair. I never will, she answered, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. Because I love you too. Since the moment you said stay, since that first dinner, since every act of kindness you thought I didn't see, I love you, Benedict. Broken, imperfect, exactly as you are. He didn't resist any longer. He kissed her. It was a kiss of life after years of death. A kiss between two survivors who had finally found peace in each other. Louisa kissed him back with the same fierce tenderness, fingers buried in his hair, bodies pressed together as if they needed the proof of touch to believe they were real. When they finally pulled apart, they were laughing and crying at once. Kneeling in the winter garden, surrounded by roses awakening from frost, they were like two souls blooming in the same breath. When? Benedict asked, breathless, still holding her hands. When can we marry? Louisa laughed, wiping tears. Whenever you wish. Tomorrow. She let out a surprised laugh. Benedict. All right. Not tomorrow. He smiled, that full, unguarded smile she rarely saw, the one that lit everything. But soon. Please tell me it can be soon. It can, she said, touching his face with endless tenderness. Hand in hand, they walked back to the house. The ruby on her finger shone like a small, living flame. Mrs. Dawson was in the corridor. She saw the ring. She saw their faces, and immediately burst into laughter and tears. Finally, she exclaimed, fanning herself with her apron. Thank heavens, finally! Benedict laughed and drew Louisa closer. Yes, he said, looking at the woman he loved. At last. Epilogue. 7 months later. Spring had returned to Creighton in full bloom. Louisa was in the garden beneath the warm May sun, kneeling between rose bushes bursting into impossible colors, deep crimsons, tender blush pinks, whites that looked like solidified light. When she touched a velvet petal, the smile that rose to her lips was not timid or wistful. It was full and steady, the smile of a woman who had rediscovered her life after believing she would never blossom again. The wedding had been simple, just as they wished. The local vicar, Mrs. Dawson, crying as though she were mother of the bride, Graves smiling, something no one had witnessed in decades, and the household staff who had become family. No pomp, no London whispers, no headlines. Just two mended souls promising to care for one another, before God and the only people who mattered. And the months that followed, Louisa closed her eyes, letting the morning warmth brush her skin. They had been months of healing, not quick, miraculous healing, but slow, patient healing built in small gestures, shared nights, and comfortable silences. Benedict still had nightmares. She still thought of the child she lost. But now, when the pain returned, neither of them faced it alone. There were hands to hold, arms to gather them close, a love, not one that erased scars, but the kind that made them bearable. Admiring your work? The familiar voice pulled her back. Louisa turned. Benedict stood on the stone path, without his cane. He still limped. He always would. But he had learned to walk without support inside the house, just as he had learned to carry his ghosts without drowning beneath them. When their eyes met, he smiled. That rare, disarming smile that still stole her breath, like first light after a long night. Our work, she corrected gently, rising and brushing soil from her apron. You helped me plant them. I only held the tools while you did the real work. He crossed to her without hesitation and drew her into his arms, a gesture that 6 months of marriage had made natural, necessary. But they turned out beautiful, like you. Louisa laughed and kissed him, a soft, familiar kiss, full of tenderness. Flatterer, truthful. He kissed her forehead, then the tip of her nose, then her lips again. Very truthful. They stood there for a moment under the warm sun, wrapped in each other. His heart beat strong, hers, steady and full. Louisa rested her cheek against his chest. Do you know what I realized today? She murmured. What? That I'm happy. Truly happy. Not just living, but wanting to live. Wanting to wake up. Wanting to see what the day brings. Benedict tightened his hold on her. So am I. His voice was rough with emotion. For the first time since I returned from the war, so am I. He kissed her long and deeply, as if each kiss were a promise of the life ahead. Then he took her hand and guided her toward the stables. Come, there's something I want to show you. Louisa followed, curious. He stopped before the stall of the black stallion, the horse he had not ridden since before the war. I rode today, after many failed attempts, Benedict said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. 40 minutes. To the lake and back. Louisa brought a hand to her mouth, overcome. Benedict. It wasn't perfect. My leg protested for the last 10 minutes, he admitted with a breath. But I rode, and for the first time in years, I didn't have the memories. I didn't see Richard. I didn't hear the screams. I only saw the path. I only felt the wind. And I thought only of you, waiting for me. Louisa embraced him tightly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm so proud of you. And I of you. He kissed the top of her head. For the roses, for the smile you wear now, for choosing to live when it hurt too much. They walked back hand in hand, sunlight warming their steps. At the entrance, Benedict paused before the door. The same door he had crossed nearly a year earlier. Broken, empty, ready to disappear. Do you remember the first night? He asked. When you asked who I was? Louisa smiled. How could I forget? That night, I thought I would never feel anything but guilt again. I thought I'd come to Creighton, to die slowly, alone. And instead? He turned to her, taking both her hands. Instead, I found you. His voice was pure truth. I found life. I found purpose. I found home. Louisa blinked back tears. I was only waiting when you arrived, she whispered. I don't even know what for. Maybe for permission to disappear. Until you said stay, and you taught me life was still worth living. They stepped inside. The fire burned in the hearth. Mrs. Dawson's habitual kindness, once a symbol of loneliness, now a symbol of warmth, of belonging. Benedict pulled Louisa close, and she remembered that first night, sitting alone before dying embers. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his face in the curve of her neck. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for not giving up on me, for giving me a reason to live. Louisa turned, cupping his face. Thank you for seeing me, for not sending me away, for choosing to stay too. The kiss they shared then was slow, deep, full of gratitude, the sum of everything they had endured and everything they still hoped for. They remained there, embraced before the fire, two lives once reduced to ruins now rising together. Outside, the roses kept blooming, and inside the house that was no longer empty, two hearts marked by war, by pain, by loss, discovered something greater than all of it. Pain remains. Scars stay. The past does not vanish. But love built on devastated ground, makes everything bearable, makes life not only possible, but precious, makes each sunrise a promise. Benedict and Louisa learned to live again, not despite the wounds, but through them, not by ignoring the past, but by honoring it, not alone, but together. Always together,